Elena was the kind of girl most people never noticed. She always sat in the back row of her music theory class, her hands folded neatly on the desk, eyes fixed on the piano keys even when she wasn't playing. Her classmates whispered that she was too quiet, or that she didn't care enough. But Elena cared deeply, more than anyone could imagine. She simply preferred silence over words and music over noise. At the prestigious St. Cecilia Music Academy, everyone was competing for attention. The students came from rich families, each trying to prove that they were born to be prodigies. They played loudly, dramatically, always hoping to impress the teachers. Elena was different. She never raised her hand, never volunteered for recitals, and never spoke unless someone asked her a direct question. Most of the teachers thought she was lazy, maybe even untalented. Her main piano teacher, Professor Grant, was a man known for his strictness. He believed talent meant nothing without confidence. To him, Elena's silence was a form of disrespect. If you can't show passion, he would say, you don't deserve the piano. Each time he said it, Elena would lower her gaze and quietly nod. Inside, though, she wasn't hurt, she was just waiting. Waiting for the right time to show who she really was. What no one knew was that Elena had a secret. She could play any song after hearing it just once. She didn't need to look at the sheet music for long. The notes, once heard, would arrange themselves perfectly in her memory like stars forming a constellation. When she was a little girl, she had discovered this by accident. Her father used to play old jazz records at home, and Elena would mimic the melodies on a small, cheap keyboard. Her parents were amazed, but they never had the money to buy her lessons. So Elena taught herself everything she knew by listening carefully, deeply, completely. When she finally earned a scholarship to St. Cecilia, she thought it would be a dream come true. But the reality was far from what she imagined. The other students looked down on her simple clothes and her quiet nature. She didn't have the expensive piano books they had, nor the confidence to brag about her talent. When it came time for recitals, she would politely decline, saying, "I'm not ready yet." The teachers began to lose patience. "Elena, you'll never improve if you don't challenge yourself," Professor Grant scolded. "You must learn to perform under pressure." Elena would just smile slightly and nod. She wasn't afraid of pressure. She was afraid of attention. When she played alone, the music came alive. But the moment people watched her, it felt as if the world became too loud, too bright. Every sound, the creak of a chair, the cough of an audience member, would steal her focus. So she hid her brilliance beneath a mask of quiet obedience. Still, there were small signs of her gift that appeared when no one expected them. During one class, a student made a mistake while practicing a Mozart sonata. Professor Grant stopped the music and asked who could correct it. Before anyone else could react, Elena softly played the passage correctly without even looking at the sheet. The teacher frowned, slightly confused. "Did you memorize that?" he asked. I think I just remembered it," she replied quietly. The class giggled, thinking she was joking. But she wasn't. In truth, Elena didn't memorize music the way others did. She understood it, felt it. Each note had a color, a texture, a feeling. When she played, she wasn't reading or recalling. She was reliving. It was like the music lived inside her. Yet she never told anyone. To her, it was something sacred, something that couldn't be explained with words or proven through applause. The next morning, the air in the academy felt heavier than usual. The students buzzed with energy. An important class performance was scheduled for the afternoon. Elena walked quietly through the long corridor, holding her music notebook close to her chest. She could hear faint notes coming from practice rooms, students rehearsing the same scales over and over again, trying to outshine one another. When she entered the classroom, she immediately noticed a change in Professor Grant's tone. He stood near the piano, arms crossed, eyes scanning the room like a hawk. "Today," he said sharply, "we are going to test how serious you all are about music." His voice echoed against the wooden walls. "Each of you will perform a piece chosen by me." No excuses. Elena's stomach tightened. She had practiced small classical pieces, calm and simple, the kind that soothed her nerves. But she already knew what was coming. The professor's gaze stopped on her and a faint smirk appeared on his face. "Miss Elena," he said, emphasizing her name. "Since you always avoid performing, today we'll see what you can actually do." He pulled out a thick folder and handed her a sheet of music. The title at the top read, Rachmaninoff, Piano Concerto No. 3. The room went silent. A few students gasped softly. Even the boldest pianists at the academy feared this piece. It was known as the mountain of piano music, beautiful but brutally difficult. "Professor," one student whispered, "that's too advanced even for the senior class." Grant ignored him. "If Elena wants to be taken seriously, she'll play something worthy of a real pianist." "You have 1 week to prepare," he said coldly. Elena stared at the page. The notes looked endless, tiny black marks dancing across the paper like a storm. Her heart pounded, but she didn't protest. She simply nodded. When class ended, the others gathered around, curious. "You're not really going to try that, are you?" one girl asked, half laughing. "Even Michael messed it up last year, and he's the best here." Elena gave a small, polite smile. "I'll try," she said softly, then walked away. That evening, she sat in her small dorm room staring at the sheet music. Her fingers itched to touch the keys. But she didn't start right away. Instead, she searched for a recording of the concerto and closed her eyes. The first few minutes were overwhelming, a whirlwind of power and emotion. But then something magical happened. The chaos began to make sense to her. Every chord, every change in rhythm unfolded like a story. She could hear the logic behind it. Over the next few nights, Elena spent hours in the empty concert hall. The janitor saw her again, slipping in quietly after everyone had left. This time he didn't interrupt. He leaned on his broom and watched. She didn't have the full sheet with her, only small notes written in her notebook. But as soon as she started playing, the room filled with life. Her fingers glided over the keys and the impossible piece began to take shape. She broke it down section by section. When she struggled, she would close her eyes and listen again to the original recording, replaying each bar in her mind until she understood how it felt. She never rushed. She didn't read the music like others did. She absorbed it. Slowly, her version of Rachmaninoff's masterpiece became more than just a copy. It became her own voice. Sometimes she played so intensely that tears rolled down her cheeks. Not from sadness, but from the pure weight of emotion in the music. To her, it was as if the piano wasn't an instrument anymore. It was speaking for her, expressing everything she never dared to say aloud. By the fifth night, her body was exhausted. Her fingers hurt, her eyes burned, but she didn't stop. Even when she stumbled on the fast passages, she laughed softly, trying again. The janitor, moved by what he saw, left a thermos of tea on the piano bench one evening. When she found it, she smiled. "Thank you," she whispered to the empty room. Word began to spread among a few students who stayed late. "Elena's practicing that monster piece," one whispered in disbelief. "She's actually doing it." But no one dared to interrupt her. They peeked from the doorway, stunned by the way she played, calm, focused, and almost trance-like. Meanwhile, Professor Grant had already made up his mind. He was certain Elena would fail. "She'll freeze on stage," he told another teacher. "Maybe then she'll finally understand that music requires more than quiet dreams." The day before the performance, Elena walked into class as usual. She was pale but composed. Her classmates kept sneaking glances at her, expecting to see fear, but she only looked peaceful. She spent the rest of the day listening to music in her headphones, tapping her fingers on her desk in rhythm, as if rehearsing in her mind. That night, she didn't practice. Instead, she sat by the window of her dorm, watching the rain. The piano piece played softly in her thoughts like a familiar friend. She wasn't nervous, she felt ready. When morning came, the concert hall buzzed with tension. The teachers sat in the front row ready to evaluate. Elena walked slowly to the piano, her black dress simple and unadorned. She placed her hands on the keys, closed her eyes for a brief moment, and took a deep breath. The audience expected hesitation, maybe a few missed notes, but the moment her fingers moved, the hall came alive. Her touch was delicate yet powerful. The melodies rose and fell like waves, each note perfectly balanced between strength and emotion. People leaned forward, forgetting to breathe. Professor Grant's face changed from sternness to disbelief. He had never seen anyone, student or professional, play with such grace. Elena wasn't just performing. She was telling a story through the music. It was as if she and the piano had become one. By the final note, there was complete silence. Then slowly, applause began to grow, soft at first, then thunderous. The teachers stood. Even Grant joined in, his eyes wide with awe. Elena stood, bowed politely and smiled, not proudly but gently, as if she had finally spoken her truth. gently as if she had finally spoken her truth. No one could believe what they had witnessed. The girl they once ignored had just conquered the hardest piece in the book. And in that moment, they all realized she hadn't been a reluctant student at all. She had been a genius waiting to be heard. That night after her performance, Elena couldn't sleep. Her hands still tingled from the piano keys, her heart replaying every note she had played. She lay on her narrow dorm bed staring at the ceiling, the echoes of Rachmaninoff drifting through her mind like distant thunder, the applause, the faces of the teachers, even the way the light had hit the piano's polished wood. It all felt like a dream she wasn't ready to wake from. But what no one knew was that this was only the beginning. The next morning, the academy was alive with gossip. In the cafeteria, students huddled around tables whispering her name. "Did you hear her play?" "I swear she didn't even look at the sheet once," said one. Another added, "Professor Grant looked like he saw a ghost." Elena quietly walked past them, tray in hand, pretending not to hear. She wasn't interested in fame. She didn't crave admiration. What she wanted was peace, a place to practice, to think, to be alone with her music. After classes, she slipped into the concert hall again. The doors creaked as she entered, and the smell of polished wood and faint dust filled the air. The janitor was there, sweeping near the back. When he saw her, he smiled warmly. "Back again, miss?" "Yes," she said softly. "If that's all right," he chuckled. "You don't need my permission. You belong here more than anyone else." She sat at the grand piano, the same one that had witnessed her triumph the day before. The seat still felt familiar under her hands, but instead of starting the same piece, she began something new, something she had written herself. The melody was soft and uncertain at first, almost like a whisper. Then it grew bolder, flowing freely, filled with curiosity and emotion. It was the kind of music that couldn't be written down easily. It had to be felt. She played for hours, completely lost in the sound. When she finally stopped, the janitor clapped quietly from the back of the hall. She turned surprised. "Sorry," he said. "Didn't mean to scare you. But that was something else." "Did you write that?" Elena nodded shyly. "It just came to me." "You've got a gift, kid," he said, shaking his head in amazement. "Don't hide it anymore." His words stayed with her long after she left. Over the following weeks, she made it a habit to sneak into the hall every night after dinner. Sometimes she practiced classical pieces. Other times she improvised, letting her feelings guide her fingers. The janitor, now her quiet friend, would leave the lights dimmed and a cup of tea on the side table. He became her only audience, listening from the shadows as she poured her heart into the piano. But outside that hall, things were changing. Word of her performance had spread beyond the academy. The headmaster had sent a recording of her playing to a local music competition without telling her. One day she was called into the office. "Elena," the headmaster said, smiling proudly, "you've been selected to represent our academy at the Winter Music Gala." Elena froze. I didn't apply for that." "I know," he said gently, "but you deserve it. The judges heard your performance. They were astonished. This could be your chance to make a real name for yourself." Her heart raced. The Winter Gala wasn't just a school event. It was one of the biggest showcases for young musicians in the country. Talented players from all over competed for scholarships and opportunities to study abroad. But instead of excitement, she felt fear. The idea of standing on another stage, this time before hundreds of strangers, made her stomach twist. "I don't think I'm ready," she murmured. The headmaster leaned forward. "Elena, talent like yours doesn't wait. You were born for this." That night, she sat alone at the piano again, torn between doubt and destiny. She played the same melody she had written days ago, but now it sounded different, heavier, as if it carried the weight of decision. The janitor came in quietly. "You okay, miss?" "I don't know," she admitted. "They want me to perform at the Winter Gala, but what if I fail?" He leaned on his broom, thinking for a moment. "You didn't play that Rachmaninoff piece for applause, did you?" "No. You played it because you felt it. That's why it was beautiful. Do the same this time. Forget the crowd. Play for yourself." His words, simple and sincere, struck her deeply. She smiled for the first time that night. Over the next month, Elena began preparing in secret. During the day, she attended her regular classes, blending in as usual. But when night came, she lived for the piano. She chose not to play another famous composition. Instead, she decided to perform something original, a piece that told her story. It began with slow, uncertain notes, echoing her early days of doubt, then grew brighter and more confident, symbolizing her transformation. Her hands ached from hours of practice, but she didn't care. Music had become her language, her truth. On the night before the gala, she sat in the empty hall one last time. The janitor brought her a small pendant on a chain. "For luck," he said. She took it, eyes soft with gratitude. "Thank you. For everything," he smiled. "You don't need luck, Miss Elena. You've already found your magic." When she began to play, even the air seemed to hold still. The piano sang under her fingers, the melody flowing like a confession. It was tender, fearless, alive, and though no one else was there to hear it, that final rehearsal was the truest performance of her life. Outside, snow began to fall, covering the academy grounds in silence. Inside, a young woman with a gift too great to be hidden finally began to believe in herself. She didn't know it yet, but that night, the quiet before the spotlight, would mark the beginning of her journey from a misunderstood student to a name the world would never forget. The morning of the Winter Gala arrived with a soft blanket of snow, covering the city. The St. Cecilia Academy looked like something out of a dream. White roofs, icy windows, and students rushing through the halls with nervous excitement. The annual gala wasn't just another performance. It was the event of the year, attended by music critics, talent scouts, and parents from across the country. Everyone wanted to shine. But while most students filled the practice rooms with the echo of nervous scales and last-minute rehearsals, Elena sat quietly near a window, watching the snowflakes fall. Her hands were still, her heart calm. She had stayed up all night, not to practice but to think. The piece she would play tonight was her own composition, the one she had written in the quiet of the empty hall. It wasn't flashy or loud. It was a story told in music, a story about fear, discovery, and hope. Professor Grant found her sitting there. "You're not practicing?" he asked, surprised. Elena looked up, her tone calm but firm. "I've already played it 100 times, Professor. Now I just want to feel it." Grant studied her for a long moment. He wasn't sure what to make of her anymore. The timid girl who once avoided attention now spoke with a quiet confidence. He finally nodded. "Very well, just don't let nerves ruin your focus. Remember, there are important people coming tonight." Elena smiled slightly. "I'll be all right." As evening approached, the academy transformed. Golden lights framed the grand concert hall, and the scent of polished wood and winter flowers filled the air. Guests in elegant coats and gowns filled the seats, their voices low and expectant. The stage glowed under warm lights, the black grand piano gleaming at its center like a waiting crown jewel. Backstage, Elena waited in a small dressing room. Her fingers rested in her lap, her reflection staring back at her from the mirror. For the first time, she wasn't thinking about perfection. She was thinking about the little girl she once was, the one who played an old keyboard in a tiny apartment, dreaming of music no one else could hear. A knock came on the door. It was the janitor holding a small paper cup of tea. "For the nerves," he said with a grin. Elena stood and accepted it. "You came?" "Wouldn't miss it," he said softly. "Show them who you are, Miss Elena." When her name was announced, the lights dimmed and silence fell over the crowd. She walked out slowly, her steps measured but steady. She wore a simple white dress, nothing fancy but graceful, and the pendant the janitor had given her hung around her neck. The hall seemed to hold its breath as she sat down at the piano. The first note rang out like a whisper in the snow. Soft, fragile, but full of life. Then came another and another, each blending seamlessly into the next. Her music told a story without words. The story of a young woman who had once been invisible, underestimated and afraid, but who had found her voice through the keys beneath her fingers. The audience leaned forward, drawn in by the honesty of her playing. It wasn't about showmanship or technique, it was about feeling. The melody rose and fell like waves on a quiet shore, delicate but powerful. The sound filled every corner of the hall, and for those few minutes, time seemed to stop. Professor Grant, sitting in the front row, felt his throat tighten. He had pushed her, criticized her, doubted her, and yet here she was, playing with a depth that went beyond anything he had ever taught. He realized that genius wasn't always loud or proud. Sometimes it hid in silence, waiting for the right moment to speak. As the piece reached its climax, Elena's fingers moved faster, not out of panic, but passion. Not out of panic, but passion. Every note shimmered with emotion, pain, joy, courage, release. The music built and built until it felt like her very soul was pouring out through the piano. Then, just as suddenly as it had risen, the melody softened. The final notes drifted through the air like snowflakes, landing gently and dissolving into silence. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then the entire hall erupted into applause, thunderous, unstoppable applause. Some audience members even stood, clapping until their hands turned red. Elena looked up, blinking as if waking from a dream. Her eyes found the janitor at the side of the hall, clapping the loudest. His smile said everything. You did it. Professor Grant was the next to rise. He clapped slowly at first, then with genuine admiration. Bravo, he whispered, more to himself than anyone else. Elena stood and bowed gracefully. She didn't smile widely or bask in the attention. Instead, she placed a hand over her heart, acknowledging the crowd with quiet gratitude. For the first time, she wasn't hiding who she was. Backstage, people surrounded her, students, teachers, even strangers offering congratulations. You're amazing. Where did you learn to play like that? Was that your own composition? Elena only answered with a modest nod. Yes, I wrote it. One of the judges, a well-known conductor, approached her. That was extraordinary, he said, his voice full of awe. You have something rare, a voice that speaks through music. We'd like to invite you to audition for the National Conservatory. Elena's eyes widened. For a moment, she didn't know what to say. She glanced toward Professor Grant, who gave a slow nod of approval. Take it, he said softly. You've earned it. Later that night, when the crowd had gone and the lights dimmed, Elena returned to the empty stage. She touched the piano once more, feeling its smooth surface beneath her fingertips. The hall was silent, but she could still hear echoes of her own music, like a promise that would never fade. The janitor joined her one last time. So, he said with a smile, how does it feel to be a star? She laughed quietly. I don't think I'm a star. I just told my story, he nodded. And that's why everyone listened. Elena looked out over the empty seats, the golden glow fading into the shadows. This is where I belong, she whispered. Not because they saw me, but because I finally saw myself. As she walked off the stage, the world outside was still blanketed in snow. But inside her, something new had begun to bloom, a confidence as warm and unstoppable as music itself. The moment Elena's fingers touched the piano keys that night, the entire concert hall seemed to hold its breath. Even before she pressed the first note, there was something magnetic in the air, a kind of quiet power that made people lean forward without realizing why. She sat completely still for a second, her eyes half closed, her face calm. It wasn't nerves. It was focus. That rare silence right before a storm of beauty. Then came the first notes. Soft, clean, delicate, and like snow melting under sunlight. The sound spread through the hall, pure and full of emotion. Within seconds, the noise of the audience faded away. There were no whispers, no movements, just that music. Fragile yet strong. Simple yet impossibly deep. The piece she played was her own creation, and though no one in the audience had ever heard it before, it felt strangely familiar. As if it spoke a language everyone somehow understood. The melody began gently, almost hesitant, then started to grow, layer upon layer like the opening of a story. Each note seemed to reveal a memory, a feeling, a truth. Professor Grant, sitting in the front row, couldn't take his eyes off her. This wasn't the shy, uncertain student he had once scolded for lack of confidence. This was someone else, and someone transformed. Her back was straight, her expression serene, her hands moving with the grace of someone who had lived every sound she played. As she continued, the rhythm shifted. Her left hand created a deep, steady pulse, the heartbeat of the song, while her right hand danced above it, spinning melodies that soared like birds over water. Her playing wasn't just technical brilliance, it was storytelling. Every rise and fall, every pause, every trembling note carried meaning. Somewhere in the back row, an old pianist who had come as a guest leaned forward, whispering to the person beside him, "She plays like she's talking to the piano." And in a way, she was. For Elena, each note was a conversation. She spoke to the piano with honesty, about the pain of being unseen, the fear of failure, the quiet joy of discovery. The piano replied in its own way, echoing her emotions, sometimes comforting her, sometimes challenging her to go deeper. It was as if two souls, hers and the instruments, were blending into one. The audience could feel it. The air grew thick with emotion. Some people closed their eyes just to listen better. Others sat frozen, afraid to blink. It wasn't just music anymore, it was life turned into sound. Halfway through the piece, the melody took a darker turn. The soft notes became stormy, the rhythm quickened. Her hands moved faster, striking the keys with intensity and purpose. You could almost hear her struggle, the pain of being doubted, the loneliness of practicing alone in the dark hall, the pressure of being told she wasn't good enough. The energy built and built, filling the space until it felt like the piano itself might burst open from emotion. Then suddenly she stopped. The silence that followed was electric, not empty, but alive. Every person in the room could feel her hesitation, that small moment of stillness that separated what had been from what was about to come. And then, with a single deep breath, she began again. This time the music turned bright, hopeful, full of light. The storm was over. Her fingers flowed smoothly across the keys, creating a melody that lifted hearts and drew tears. It was as if the music itself forgave everything, the doubts, the pain, the past. Professor Grant felt something shift inside him. He realized almost painfully that all his lessons about control and precision had missed the most important part of music, the heart. Watching her, he understood that Elena didn't learn to play this way. She simply was this way. The music was not something she performed. It was who she was. As she approached the final passage, the sound grew softer again, returning to that fragile beauty from the beginning. The notes shimmered like light reflecting off water. Her eyes remained closed, her breathing slow and steady. With one final movement, she pressed the last chord, gentle, complete, and heartbreakingly perfect. For a moment, the hall was silent. The kind of silence that only exists after something extraordinary. No one dared to move. The music still hung in the air, echoing inside their minds like a memory they didn't want to lose. Then came the applause, a wave of it, sudden and overwhelming. It started with one person, then another, until the entire hall was on its feet. Some people were crying openly. Others just stared, clapping as if afraid to break the spell. Elena slowly opened her eyes. She blinked, dazed as if waking from a dream. She hadn't played for fame or praise or recognition. She had played because she had to, because her soul needed to speak. And now that it had, she felt at peace. She stood and bowed slightly, her face calm but her eyes glistening with quiet joy. Somewhere in the front row, the janitor was smiling proudly, his hands red from clapping. Professor Grant, too, rose from his seat. His applause was slower, more thoughtful, filled with respect, and maybe a little regret. When the lights came up and the audience continued to cheer, Elena looked down at the piano one last time. Her reflection shimmered on its polished surface, the reflection of someone who had finally found her place in the world. She smiled faintly, whispering so softly that no one else could hear, "Thank you." Because for her, it wasn't the audience or the applause that mattered. It was the music, the language that had never failed her, the voice that had always been inside her waiting to be heard. And on that night, through every note and every silence between them, the world had finally listened. For a long moment after Elena finished playing, the audience remained utterly silent. The air felt charged, as if every breath in the hall was suspended in that fragile space between disbelief and awe. The sound of the final note still echoed faintly in the rafters, shimmering like light on water. Then suddenly a single clap broke the stillness. It came from the back of the hall, hesitant, almost unsure, but it was enough to break the spell. Within seconds, the entire room erupted into applause. People stood to their feet, cheering, clapping, shouting her name. Some were even crying. The emotion in the hall was too real, too overwhelming to contain. Elena sat frozen for a moment, her hands resting lightly on the keys. Her heart pounded, but not from fear, from disbelief. She had dreamed of this feeling before, but now that it was real, it didn't feel like a dream. It felt bigger. Professor Grant stood among the first. He didn't clap politely like a teacher. He applauded like a man witnessing something holy. His eyes were wet, though he didn't seem to notice. "Incredible," he whispered to himself. "Absolutely incredible." When Elena finally rose and turned toward the audience, she looked humbled, almost shy. The spotlight hit her face, and for the first time she didn't flinch under it. She simply bowed her head slightly, her hair falling softly to the side, and whispered a quiet, "Thank you." The applause grew louder. A few students from her class, the same ones who once laughed at her for being so quiet, were now screaming her name with tears in their eyes. The irony, tears in their eyes. The irony wasn't lost on them. They had spent months underestimating her, and now they were witnessing something they could never forget. Backstage, the organizers were in chaos, rushing to prepare awards, rewriting speeches, trying to find the right words to describe what had just happened. The judges exchanged looks of astonishment. "She's beyond talented," one said. "That wasn't performance, and that was art." When Elena finally stepped off stage, the headmaster greeted her first. "My dear," he said, voice trembling with emotion, "I have seen hundreds of students perform in this academy, but what you just did, that was history." She smiled politely, still dazed. "Thank you, sir." Moments later, Professor Grant appeared. His usual stern expression was gone, replaced by something gentler, a mix of pride and remorse. For a second, he said nothing. Then quietly he said, "Elena, I owe you an apology." She blinked in surprise. "For what?" "For not seeing you sooner," he said, his voice thick with sincerity. "For mistaking silence for weakness. You've reminded me tonight why I became a teacher in the first place. You've reminded me that talent isn't loud, it just needs space to be heard." Elena's eyes softened. "You helped me, Professor. You pushed me. If you hadn't challenged me, maybe I would have never played that piece." He chuckled softly, shaking his head. "You would have found your way no matter what. People like you always do." Then from behind him came the familiar voice of the janitor.
"There she is!"
he exclaimed, clapping proudly as he shuffled in. "Our shining star." Elena laughed and hugged him without hesitation. The old man grinned wide, his eyes crinkling with warmth. "Didn't I tell you, Miss Elena? You didn't need luck. You just needed to believe in yourself." "Thank you," she whispered. "For staying, for listening, for believing when no one else did." He waved a hand dismissively. "Bah, I just kept the lights on. You did the rest." As they spoke, the doors opened again. Several judges and reporters entered, eager to speak to the mysterious young woman who had stolen the night. Cameras flashed, microphones appeared. Questions poured in. "Who taught you? What was that composition called? Are you planning to compete internationally?" Elena's head spun. She wasn't used to so much attention. Still, she answered softly, her voice steady. "I learned by listening," she said. "And the piece? It doesn't really have a name. It's just me." That single line spread like wildfire. By the next morning, every headline used it. The girl who played herself. Silent genius leaves audience speechless. Young pianist redefines what it means to feel music. At the academy, things were never the same again. Students who had once ignored her now greeted her warmly in the halls. Some even asked her for lessons or advice. The teachers, too, treated her differently, with respect and admiration. But Elena never let it change who she was. She still arrived early, sat quietly in the back of class, and spent her evenings alone in the concert hall, practicing not for others, but for herself. Professor Grant began using her story as an example in his lectures. "True art," he would say, "comes not from confidence but from honesty. And honesty is what Miss Elena taught us all." One afternoon, a famous music director visited the academy, asking to meet her. He had seen a video of her performance online and wanted to offer her a place in an international orchestra. "You could tour the world," he said. "Perform for thousands. Are you interested?" Elena hesitated for a long moment before answering. "Maybe one day," she said. "But for now I just want to learn more. There's still so much I don't understand about music." The director smiled, both surprised and impressed. "A true artist never stops learning," he said, shaking her hand. That night, as the sun set and the hall emptied once more, Elena returned to her favorite spot on stage. She sat at the piano and began to play softly, improvising. No sheet music, no audience, no pressure. Just her, the piano, and the faint echo of her own heart. The janitor passed by, paused, and listened from the doorway like always. She looked up and smiled at him. "You're still here," she said. "Someone's got to keep the hall clean," he replied with a grin. "Besides, I like your concerts better than the fancy ones." She laughed, then went back to playing. In that quiet hall under the dim golden lights, Elena's music drifted through the air once again, calm, beautiful, alive. The world might have discovered her genius, but she remained exactly as she'd always been, a quiet soul who spoke through sound. And though the applause from that unforgettable night had long faded, its echo lived on, in the hearts of everyone who had heard her play, and most of all in Elena's own. After the Winter Gala, Elena's life began to change in quiet, unexpected ways. Her name started spreading across music circles, first inside the academy, then far beyond. Articles called her the silent prodigy or the girl who played her soul. Videos of her performance filled the internet, shared by people who couldn't stop talking about the mysterious young woman who played with such emotion that she made an entire audience cry. But while the world was starting to see her as a genius, inside the academy people were still trying to understand her. She hadn't studied under famous teachers. She didn't come from a musical family. Her technique wasn't taught, it was felt. How could someone so quiet, so unassuming, play with the depth of a master? Even Professor Grant, who now looked at her with new eyes, found himself wondering about her past. He called her into his office one afternoon, not as a teacher testing a student, but as a man searching for truth. "Elena," he said gently, "I've been teaching for more than 20 years. I've seen many talented students, but you're different. Tell me honestly, where did you learn to play like that?" She hesitated, lowering her gaze. Her hands rested on her lap, fingers still marked from long hours of practice. "Nowhere," she said quietly. "I just listened." "Listened?" he repeated, confused. She nodded. "When I was a child, my father used to play old records. Classical, jazz, anything he could find. We didn't have much, but music was always there. I used to sit on the floor with my ear close to the speaker, trying to follow every note. Later, when I found an old keyboard in a thrift shop, I started copying the sounds I remembered." Professor Grant leaned back, astonished. "So, you never had lessons?" "Not until I came here," she admitted. "I learned by ear. I could hear a song once and remember it. Not just the melody and everything. The layers, the timing, the emotion. I didn't even know it was strange until people told me." He was silent for a long time, staring at her with something like disbelief. Finally, he said, "Elena, do you realize what that means? What you have? It's something people study for years and never achieve. It's not just talent, it's extraordinary." Elena smiled softly. "Maybe, but I didn't play to be extraordinary. I just played because it made me feel alive." Word of her story spread through the academy like wildfire. Students who had once dismissed her now whispered in awe. "She never took lessons," they said. "She just knows." Some refused to believe it. Others were inspired, realizing that true art could come from the heart, not just textbooks. Soon after, the academy was visited by a team from a national newspaper. They wanted to interview Elena for a feature story about hidden talents. She sat in the library, nervous but composed, while the journalist asked questions. "When did you realize you had this gift?" She thought for a moment. "When I was little," she said, "but I didn't call it a gift. It was just me. I couldn't explain how I knew what note came next. I could just feel it." "Did your parents support your music?" Her smile faded slightly. "My father did. He loved music, but he passed away when I was 12. My mother worked long hours. She didn't understand why I wanted to spend all my time playing, so I learned quietly whenever I could." The journalist scribbled quickly, fascinated. "And now you're one of the most talked about young pianists in the country. How does that feel?" Elena shrugged lightly. "Strange," she said honestly. "People think being a genius means being proud or sure of yourself. But I don't feel that way. I just feel grateful. Music was my only friend for a long time. It never judged me. It just listened back." When the article was published, it touched thousands of hearts. Readers around the world wrote letters and messages saying her story gave them hope. Parents showed their children her video saying, "See, you don't need to be loud to be special." But not everyone was kind. Some critics accused the Academy of exaggerating her story for fame. Others claimed her performance was too emotional to be technical. One harsh review even said, "She plays like she's dreaming, not studying." When Elena read it, she didn't get angry. She simply smiled and said to herself, "Exactly." Meanwhile, Professor Grant became her strongest supporter. He spent hours studying her technique, trying to understand what made her playing so powerful. One evening, he asked her to demonstrate how she learned new music. She listened to a short piece on his laptop, then turned to the piano and played it perfectly from memory. He stared, amazed. "You're not just repeating it, you're interpreting it." "I don't know how to play it any other way," she said. "Music isn't just sound. It's like a feeling wearing a melody." Soon, talent scouts began to call. Prestigious conservatories, orchestras, and festivals wanted her to perform. Invitations came from Paris, Vienna, New York, but Elena hesitated. She wasn't chasing fame. She was chasing understanding one night. As snow fell outside her window, she called her mother for the first time in months. "Mama," she said softly, "they want me to play in Europe." Her mother was quiet for a while. "Your father would have been so proud," she finally said. "He always said music lived inside you. I didn't understand before, but now I do." Elena's eyes filled with tears. "I just wish he could hear me play again." "He does," her mother whispered. "Every time you touch those keys." After that call, Elena sat down at her piano and began to compose again. This time the melody was slower, deeper, full of memory and warmth. It was for her father, but also for herself, a song of acceptance. And when she played it alone in the empty hall, the janitor standing quietly by the door, it was as if the walls themselves leaned in to listen. The music wrapped around her like an embrace, and gentle, familiar, eternal. That night she understood something for the first time. Being a genius wasn't about being perfect. It was about being honest, about letting the truth inside your heart flow freely through your hands. And that truth, her truth, was finally out in the open, glowing brighter than any spotlight could ever shine. Months passed after Elena's name first reached the newspapers, but the magic of that night at the Winter Gala never faded. Her story was retold in classrooms, music blogs, and even television interviews. They called her the quiet virtuoso, the girl who heard music differently, and sometimes simply, Elena, the genius nobody saw coming. But despite all the attention, Elena stayed the same. She still wore her modest clothes, still carried her small notebook filled with song sketches, and still found comfort in the quiet hours of the evening when the world slept and only the piano kept her company. What changed, though, was how others saw her. Professors who once overlooked her now greeted her with warmth and respect. Younger students gathered around her during lunch breaks, asking for advice, and she helped them gently, never with arrogance, but with the same calm patience that had always defined her. Yet Elena never forgot where she came from. She often thought of her father, the one who'd unknowingly planted the seed of her music long ago. Every time her fingers touched the piano, she felt his presence beside her, the faint memory of his laughter, the sound of old records spinning on a dusty player, the way he used to hum along to jazz tunes. Those memories were her roots, grounding her no matter how high she climbed. Soon, invitations from abroad began pouring in. Prestigious conservatories from Vienna, Paris, and New York wanted her to study or perform. Agents called, offering fame and fortune. One day, Professor Grant approached her after class with a letter in his hand. "It's from the Royal Conservatory in London," he said with a proud smile. "They've offered you a full scholarship. It's one of the greatest honors a pianist your age could receive." Elena took the letter in trembling hands. It was surreal. Everything she had once thought impossible was now within reach. "That's incredible," she whispered. Grant's smile softened. "You've earned it, Elena. But whatever you decide, don't let anyone take the soul out of your music. It's what makes you who you are." She nodded, though part of her was uncertain. Fame didn't excite her. Peace did. Still, she knew that this was more than a chance for herself. It was a doorway for every quiet dreamer who had ever been told they weren't enough. Before leaving for London, she played one last concert at St. Cecilia Academy. The hall was packed, every seat filled. Her old classmates, the teachers, even the janitor. Everyone came to see her off. When she stepped onto the stage, she didn't announce her piece. She simply smiled and began to play. The song was one she had written the night her father passed away, a piece she had never shared with anyone before. It was slow and soft at first, like a lullaby, but then grew into something vast and luminous. The melody painted a journey, from darkness to light, from doubt to belief. By the end, many in the audience were crying silently. It wasn't sadness, and it was gratitude. the kind that comes from witnessing something pure. When the final chord faded, Elena looked out over the faces of those who had once doubted her and said softly, "Thank you for teaching me that silence isn't weakness. It's where music begins." Afterward, she found the janitor waiting by the piano, holding his cap in his hands. "So you're really leaving, huh?" he said with a bittersweet smile. "Yes," she said, "but I'll come back. This place gave me everything," he nodded. "Just promise me one thing. Don't forget who you are when the crowds start cheering." "I won't," she replied. "The girl who played alone at night is still here." That night, as she walked through the snow-covered courtyard one last time, she looked up at the academy windows glowing faintly behind her. Somewhere deep inside, she knew her journey was only beginning. Years later, Elena became one of the youngest pianists ever to perform at the Royal Albert Hall. Critics described her as the soul of the piano itself. But what made her special wasn't just her technical mastery. It was the emotion behind every performance, the way her music seemed to whisper secrets directly into people's hearts. When interviewers asked about her success, she always gave the same humble answer: "I'm not special. I just listened when the world was quiet." She never lost her humility. Whenever she returned home, she visited St. Cecilia Academy and spent hours teaching students who were shy, uncertain, or overlooked, students who reminded her of herself. She told them stories of her failures and fears, showing them that brilliance can bloom in silence. One afternoon, years later, she found Professor Grant in the old hall, his hair now silver. He smiled when he saw her. "You've done well, Elena," he said proudly. She sat beside him at the piano. "You once said music is courage," she reminded him. "You were right." "And you," he said softly, "prove that courage can be quiet." That evening, she gave a private recital for the academy. No cameras, no press, just her and her students. The janitor, older but still working, stood in the back once more, listening with the same wide-eyed wonder as years before. When the music ended, he clapped slowly, tears in his eyes. As she stood and looked around the hall, the place where her journey began, she felt a deep peace. This was her legacy. Not the awards or the fame, but the lives she had touched, the hearts she had awakened, the quiet reminder that greatness can come wrapped in gentleness. The girl who once feared to be seen had become a light for others, and long after her final concert, her music continued to play. Not just through recordings or grand stages, but in the small moments when someone, somewhere, sat before a piano and dared to believe that silence could become song. Because Elena had taught the world one simple truth: you don't have to shout to be heard. Sometimes the most powerful voice is the one that whispers. One afternoon, as the semester was coming to an end, Professor Grant called her to his office. "Elena," he said, leaning back in his chair, "I don't think you're trying hard enough. You have potential but no drive. Music isn't just about feeling, it's about courage. If you can't step up, you'll never survive in this academy." Elena listened quietly. She wanted to tell him that she practiced every night, that she poured her heart into every note even when no one saw her. But instead she just said, "Yes, Professor. I understand." She left the room feeling misunderstood but not defeated. That night she went to the empty concert hall. The room was dim, the air still. She sat at the grand piano and pressed a single key. The sound echoed softly, like a whisper in the dark. Then another key and another. Within minutes her fingers danced across the keyboard, weaving melodies that felt both joyful and lonely. The music spoke for her, every unspoken word, every hidden emotion. She didn't notice that the janitor had stopped sweeping to listen. He stood in the doorway, stunned. He had cleaned that hall for 20 years and he had heard many students play, but never like this. When Elena finished, she simply closed the lid of the piano, gathered her books and left quietly, completely unaware that she had just delivered a performance more powerful than any recital. At that moment, she was still the reluctant student in everyone's eyes, a quiet girl who didn't stand out, who didn't seem to belong. But soon everything would change. The teachers who doubted her, the classmates who laughed at her, they were all about to discover what Elena had been hiding all along, a genius that could no longer be contained.